My guest today deserves high praise in the conversation of consciousness, having devoted his entire professional life to its research and its lexicon. Dr. Raymond Moody is a psychiatrist who coined the term near-death experience all the way back in 1975 when he wrote his seminal book called Life After Life. He's since written over a dozen books on consciousness existing beyond the physical body. Dr. Moody is not only a medical doctor, he also holds a PhD in philosophy and psychology. Like my friend Charles Tart in 1998, he sat on the Bigelow Chair of Consciousness Studies at the University of Nevada. Dr. Moody is what I would refer to as a giant on the subject of consciousness studies, and it's my honor to speak with him today. Raymond, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Welcome to this conversation.
It is just so great to be here. I'm so glad to be with you, Mark, and greetings to all the folks listening in, too.
I know they're very excited. I was so excited when my producers told me that you consented to this interview because I think you bring such a unique perspective to this conversation of consciousness. And I'm hoping that you may actually be able to fill in some blanks in my personal understanding of what consciousness is. Life After Life is perhaps the very first book that I read on the subject of consciousness surviving the physical body. The only books that I can think of that I may have been aware of at the time that addressed the subject at all were the catechisms that I was given as a kid by my local church. And they indicated an afterlife as being heaven, hell, or purgatory as your options. Your book introduced me to some very different perspectives and opened up a lot of what potential existed beyond the physical body. So I know you come from a secular upbringing and a scientific background. Obviously, my first question to you is, how did you get started in what was to become your life's work surrounding the NDE phenomenon?
Well, I thank God sincerely that I was not raised religious. Mm-hmm. And my dad was a medic in World War II in the Pacific Theater. He was a surgeon. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, he didn't talk much. That generation didn't talk. But I imagine that the reason he was so sarcastic about religion when I was a kid was what he had seen in the war, is what I gathered.
Right, right.
But anyway, you know, he was just kind of down on religion. And it was neither here nor there to me because I was fascinated by astronomy.
Really?
Yeah, that was where I came in. I wanted to be, when I was 8 years old, I wanted to be a comedian and an astronomer. And so I also was a big fan of Dr. Seuss. The Cat in the Hat came lots later. Mm-hmm. I was more Horton Hears a Who and Thidwick, the Big-Hearted Moose. Mm-hmm. And that was and also Lewis Carroll and Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comic books written by the great Disney artist Carl Barks, who's been hailed by Spielberg and Lucas as among their heroes.
Right.
And so I was just fascinated by the way the whole idea of nonsense and the incomprehensible, right? And so looking through a telescope when I was 7 or 8 years old and forming that question that you did when we all do, you know, it's like, how big is this thing we're in?
Right, right.
So your mind zooms out to the wall, right? But then just me think, just a minute, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall?
Right.
So I quickly realized that either option is totally meaningless and unintelligible. And plus, that was good for me because I loved nonsense, Dr. Seuss and so on. So I just kind of realized early in life that you know, we live in a block of nonsense and that's okay. And the idea of an afterlife just didn't dawn on me. My two areas of associations to it was the New Yorker cartoons. My dad subscribed to the New Yorker. There was occasionally cartoons of the angels and the clouds at the pearly gates and so on. And also a Jack Benny movie that my aunt had taken me to. It was just presented as a comic premise that there was an afterlife, right? So there I went. I went to the University of Virginia at age 18, intent on studying astronomy. Had been interested in philosophy in high school, so I took a philosophy class and I was hooked. Just in the first few days of class, I'm going to be a philosophy major, which I did. I went on and got my my bachelor's, master's, and PhD in philosophy from there. And what turned me on about philosophy was Plato's Republic.
I understand.
And just in reading the first couple of pages, I was hooked. And then the Republic goes down in this dramatic fashion, and it comes to this amazing culmination and the story of a near-death experience of the warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield, but he revived during his funeral and told this story of getting out of his body and going through a passageway into another world. And the fact that Plato, who was already my hero, took this seriously, that really woke me up to the importance of this question of an afterlife that I never even thought about before. So I asked Professor Hammond, like, what's this? And Professor Hammond said, yeah, these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who had apparently died but revived, and that Plato took them seriously. But that Democritus, for example, who came a little before Plato, had studied these things, and he said, well, there's no such thing as a moment of death. And Democritus had figured out just by reason that this world is made up of tiny little bits called atoms.
Right.
So he said, what's going on in these experiences is it's the residual biological activity in the body on the atomic level. And that accounts for these experiences. There's no such thing as a moment of death, right? So that's the account. The still debate, right? Still the same form of debate between those who take this seriously as indicators of an afterlife and those who say these days the Democritan view, but it's the oxygen deprivation to the brain, they say, right?
Or perhaps DMT is the current line.
Right. Current. And so I was just very impressed by this but it didn't occur to me that could be something still pertaining to modern day America. But 3 years later, in February of 1965, I believe it was, I heard that right there in Charlottesville at the university was Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry there, who had such an experience. So I took the opportunity. Dr. Ritchie gladly talked to student groups and so on. I heard his story, and I mean, it had such a powerful impact on me because, number one, George Ritchie, to this day, he was the finest human being I ever knew, period. He really was. And the way he told this experience, that's probably the first time I experienced what I would think, is the divine coming through, right? And so, to make a long story short, I heard of another case while I was still an undergraduate, but then got my PhD in philosophy, and I started teaching philosophy at a university. And teaching Plato's Phaedo, I found the students would come up afterward, I want to talk more about this life after death. Reminds me of my grandmother, or a student who had an experience. And I began to hear them from my colleagues as well.
Right.
So that was the process. Then after 3 years of teaching philosophy, I went to medical school with the intent of becoming a forensic psychiatrist, which I did. But interestingly enough, Mark, right about the time when I was graduated from medical school, and I was getting ready to go into my residency in psychiatry, was when my comedy career was. For about 10 years I'd been, doing these things, but then all of a sudden I began to get more invitations than I could manage, right? So I could have gone that route. But I had a choice between comedy and murder, so I chose murder. Right? And I went on to study forensic psychiatry, work with the people like you read about in the National Enquirer, grind their parents up in a meat grinder and so on. Just an absolutely fascinating thing. But all through this career, I have continued to interview thousands of people who went to the brink of death and came back from it to tell us of these common experiences. Obviously, I quickly realized that these are not idiosyncratic. That even though they are completely change a person's life, they definitely have a pattern. And I realized there's about 15 or so common elements which crop up in a lot of different stories. And one person who comes close to death may recall 3 or 4 or 5 of these, or rather 7 or 8 or 9. Some people, in rare instances, usually when the cardiac arrest goes on, these unbelievable limits you realize, you hear about, were just like, that don't make medical sense, but nonetheless occur. Right. That in those cases, it was more likely that people would get this full blown picture. So I was just impressed by this common pattern. And I wrote about it in this book, Life After Life. And I was kind of expecting that book would go out to a few medical doctors and psychologists was my intended audience, people in the healthcare professions who would be in a position to ask among their own patients. People say, "Oh, Raymond, you were so brave." Well, that is just not correct. When I published that book, I knew full well that any physician or psychologist who, wanted to check up on me would quickly find cases among their own patients. I mean, I just knew it because it was, but I think it was due to the fact that even though these experiences had always occurred, in the 60s and 70s, the advent of cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques was bringing rafts of people back from a state that used to be rare. And so I just realized that was going on. So people say, "Oh, you were so brave." No. It didn't have anything to do with bravery. I was aware that at that point, anybody who diligently wanted to try to confirm or refute what I had come up with would be in a position to do so as long as they were in some medical context. And that happened as well. I quickly began to get communications from medical doctors who said, "I didn't know what to think about this, but I asked the patient, yeah, you're right." And so, but I did not anticipate the popular reception of it. That really, I was just totally taken aback by the fact that it quickly became a international bestseller.
Yes.
I graduated in November of 75. I published Life After Life. Raymond Moody, obscure medical student, right? Then November of 75. Then in January of 76, I got my MD degree, graduated from medical school. And then about a month later, I heard myself referred to as the eminent Dr. Moody. It was like, yes. I read that we talked about near death, and we know these things are true because they were described to us by the eminent Dr. Raymond Moody. And so I thought, well, why am I the eminent Dr. Raymond Moody? It's that I've described these things. So that was kind of how this came about.
There are so many things to unpack, and I'm so moved by your story. I'm thinking, first of all, the University of Virginia. There's something magical about Charlottesville in the field of consciousness studies. It's a very open place. It's a place of inquiry. I want to thank you, first of all, for acknowledging at that bifurcation point between comedy and serious inquiry into life's bigger questions. Thank you for taking that route and for bringing the lightness of comedy into all of your presentation of that. Not to mention the gravitas that you do hold as the eminent Dr. Moody. Now you're the venerable Dr. Moody.
Venerable, yes. Venerable. Now I'm venerable.
There are others of your ilk that I refer to as giants in consciousness studies, very much oriented towards Central Virginia. I'm assuming that you know them. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross comes to mind.
He's a dear friend.
Dr. Charles Tart comes to mind.
I knew Charlie not as well as the others, but I met Charlie very well.
Brilliant mind. And, of course, our mutual friend, Robert Monroe, who you obviously
Robert Monroe.
Who was not a doctor at all, but a very curious mind. So I'm very curious to know your thoughts about consciousness anomalies, such as the OBE. which I always personally held as being quite a different experience from a near-death experience, in that the person having the experience obviously doesn't die for any period of time. I thought that would
That's
be
right.
a good line of demarcation. But I'm starting to get a sense that there's quite a lot of correlations and similarities based on the ontologies of these experiences. What are your thoughts about the differences, say, between an out-of-body experience and a near-death experience? How do they differ from your perspective?
Well, I would say that out of body experiences commonly occur during near death experiences. What people say is that when their heart stops beating,
Right.
they say they get out of their body, they rise up typically below the ceiling in the operating room. They can see their own physical bodies down below. And then they become aware that this has something to do with death, and they become aware of a passageway. They say they zoom through this passageway into a realm of light, and they feel comforted, at peace, complete love sort of pervades everything. They say they meet relatives or friends of theirs who have passed away, now in spirit form,
Right.
as it were. They see panoramic visions in which every detail of their lives are reviewed, and often in the accompaniment of a divine presence who sort of guides them through this and helps them to realize that the purpose of this life that we're in is to love, and secondarily, it's often remarked, to acquire knowledge. Okay, so they come back from these experiences completely transformed. Now, out-of-body experiences also occur in several conditions that are not being close calls with death.
Right.
One of them, for example, being performing great music on stage. I have a friend, Eric Pagani, who used to be, I think, with PBS as a music expert, who, in addition to being a psychologist and with Psychology Today, or Psychology in Paris,
Right.
as a writer for them and as a psychologist, and he is also, to my great admiration, the consultant psychologist at Disneyland Paris.
Really?
Okay. And so in 1988, Eric was telling me that he was playing a concert, and that suddenly he just left his body. He zoomed up. He was in this light, and he came back into his body 17 minutes later, sitting at the piano, having played 3 pieces. Okay? And so Eric is a very sweet and modest guy. So I said, well, did people enjoy the performance?
Right. Obvious question.
And he said, very, just he's so gentle. He said, well, yes, they seem to. Fortunately, his sister was there, and she had been at the concert. And she said, as a matter of fact, people were jumping up and down, yelling and screaming. So it was a very powerful performance he did while he was out of his body. Okay. Now, Eric reasoned correctly that, well, if this has happened to me, surely it's happened to other singers. So he asked around among his operatic friends and said, yeah, this happens. And wrote a book about it in France, actually. And so it can be during the performance of great art. It can be by being out in nature, where you're amidst great natural beauty. People sometimes say they find themselves out of their body.
Certainly.
Or it can be just like spontaneous with no apparent precipitants. And so the out-of-body experience is something that occurs often during near-death experiences, but may also occur in other contexts as well. Now, when it's accompanied in the near-death experience, it has a much more powerful effect on people, I think.
In what ways?
Well, in the sense that I think that a lot of the after effect of near-death experiences come from these life reviews, in which you see everything you've ever done from the perspective of the people with whom you've interacted. right? Well, imagine that. You know,
Yeah.
if you see yourself doing something mean to somebody, then you're going to feel that sad feelings.
Right.
And if you see yourself in this review doing a positive thing, you'll feel the good feelings. So people come back from this, whatever they had been chasing. You know, people, I realized as a psychiatry resident, almost everybody's chasing something.
Very
You know,
true.
many people are chasing power or money or fame or any of these other things. And, you know, I've been chasing knowledge. It's
Right.
where I am.
Right.
And, but whatever they were chasing before, they said after this, they realized that the most important thing we should be seeking in this life is to learn to love. And even that powerful vision, they still say it's not easy, even when you come back. Is the way I like to say it is, let's face it, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And that doesn't change, but it does put people on a spiritual quest. That much I've seen, you know, in the thousands of people I've talked with.
Well, you spoke about the 15 changes that occur, the hallmarks of an NDE, many of which are similar to out-of-body experiences or other transcendental experiences.
Yes.
And that's where my knowledge gap comes from. Because of my personal experiences and having been privy to the experiences of so many others. I was watching an interview that you did with Jeffrey Mishlow many years ago. And
many years ago.
Yeah, and you mentioned that after dying, patients reported a new sense of identity. So I want to try to break down some of these experiences and what they mean in terms of how they, well, first, how they correlate to like-kind experiences and what they mean to us personally as we pursue life after such experiences. Because it's like a bifurcation point for me.
Yes, that's right.
So after dying, these patients often report a new sense of identity. And this new sense of identity, this sense of I, who I am and how I have my way in being in the world, seems to be regarding their point of reference as to who they are or perceive themselves to be in interpersonal relationships, right?
Yes, that's right.
So is it fair to say that you would refer to this from a psychological standpoint as a disassociation from ego?
Yes, that's one aspect. That's right. And another kind of thing people try to get at when they're talking about this is, number one, it's the whole experience is ineffable anyway, indescribable.
Right.
So there is a language difficulty in that the states they experience can't really be put into ordinary language in a meaningful way. So that becomes a difficulty. But it does put people on this reflective path of what am I or who am I? What makes us up?
Right.
And of course, that is one of the great questions of philosophy. And Plato kind of got it started, really, for us and Pythagoras before him, with this notion of an immaterial, immortal soul.
Yes.
And that got, made official. And then only after things sort of loosened up a little bit with Hobbes, for example, in the 1500s, who looked at this and he said, well, really, if you think about it, the notion of immaterial, immortal soul doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Right. Said it's unintelligible. So, but then, so what is the self? If this question of an immortal, immaterial soul gets iffy, then what? And then, Locke looked at it and Locke said, well, John Locke, and we are our consciousness and our memories.
Right.
Our conscious memories, what constitutes the self. But then the great skeptic and one of my favorite philosophers, David Hume, 1711 to 1776, he said, well, when I look inside myself, I can't find any substrate. What I always catch is the impression of the moment. There's nothing stable under there.
Right.
And so this is a lot of modern psychology kind of thinks of this, as the notion of the self is non-existent as we think of it, or as illusory or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But from my point of view, these are big philosophical questions, and I can say what I have thought, what I have come up with as my solution to the problem of personal identity is what really impresses me, Mark, about consciousness is that consciousness has a narrative vector to it.
Yes.
That your mind is telling a story and your life is a story, right? That whenever something new happens to you, you integrate that event into your continuing life story.
Right.
I hear that cinematographers have something called a Kulikov effect, I think it's called. But if you take any two random images, like a pill bottle and a pair of glasses, right, and you present them to people in a sequence, the mind automatically starts weaving a story.
Right.
And that's how consciousness is.
Yeah, we are sense-making machines, we human beings, aren't we?
That's right.
That's right.
And so what I would say is, what is your personal identity? It's your story. I, Raymond Moody, am the subject of such and such a story.
Right.
And I think that's, this is speculation on my part, but David Hume and his great essay on immortality said, he said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. And by that understatement, he was being ironic, right?
Right.
And he went on to say some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose. And some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And what he was saying is that which is actually true if you think it true, that the question of an afterlife doesn't fit in Aristotelian logic. No. And the mind that we have doesn't seem to be set up to solve it. But what Hume was doing was he was saying that therefore it's impossible, right? That was his real point. But then it's very interesting that in that essay, he says that the only conception of an afterlife that he thought that a genuinely philosophical person could entertain would be reincarnation.
That would be one possibility, certainly.
And the reason I think that Hume made that provision, and this is my speculation, but I think that it's probably because he was a great historian. Naturally, he realized the role of narrative in human affairs. That, you can't really think of humans without narratives. So that's kind of where I'd say, what is my personal identity? I am the subject of a narrative, of a life story.
Right.
So when I did some geriatric psychiatry for a year in the VIP clinic where, the chief of police and the town elders and town celebrities, it's not nice for them to have to come up to the door of the mental health clinic with the rest of us peons. I think it's reasonable to make provision. So I was for a year, I got to talk to the older, movers and shakers. And, and I repeatedly from these very accomplished people heard this remark that, Raymond, the older I get, the more when I look back at my life, I feel it's been a story or a drama or a play or a movie or a novel. They would use different labels. And, what I think comes out of that is that it's standard views of the mind-body relationship or the problem of personal identity. I think that comes, in my mind, closest of all. And now, see, somebody who knows logic would justifiably say, just a minute here, Raymond, that's one of Aristotle's original logical fallacies. Right. Because what you're doing is, you're taking this one aspect of human existence, namely the theater, and you're putting it out there as a model of the whole. And that is the logical fallacy of literalizing a metaphor. Right. And I see that objection. However, I think that it was the other way around. I think that the reason why we have the theater is that wise people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides had just realized this by their process of living. And so basically what happened was there was this harvest festival that was very, traditional in Athens and going on a long time. And they had a chorus that would sing the old songs and stories, right? But for reasons unknown, this one guy, Thespis, stepped forward from the chorus and spoke his own lines, and it created a sensation. Well, what are the ancient Greeks all about? Well, the main thing we have is athletics, right? Everything was a competition. Right. So, let's have a contest, right? Like to see who can do the best one of this.
Right.
The first winner, Aeschylus. Then you went through a period of Sophocles, then Euripides. 50 years after that started, the theater was a profession. Okay, now what that means to me is that these people had just realized, that's how we are. So if we clear out a flat space here and build these sets and all, we can crunch it down in time, act it out. And so it created a sensation. And still is.
It is amazing. It helped Western society towards this thing that we now know as self-reflection, which is a function of consciousness. I want to pick up on this when we come back from our break. I also want to talk about the ontology of the near-death experience as you brought it to Western society. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with Dr. Moody in just a moment.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
So I'm thinking about the way we tell ourselves stories, our personal stories of life. The way that you presented this speaks to consciousness as being a compendium of sensory input and awareness and cognitive content, the story, memories.
Yeah.
When we get into a situation where we are having to experience something that we have no frame of reference for, such as an NDE or an out-of-body experience, you spoke in that conversation with Jeffrey about an ontology that seemed to flow, and you mentioned it earlier. We go into a place of ego dissociation, I'll put it in that box for a moment, where our reference for self changes, and that takes on an even greater type of ego transcendence in that it's difficult to describe, apparently. We don't have language for it, and the experiences are ineffable. So the idea there, for me personally, having had such experiences, is that I don't have language because the experience is new, and I have, it's pre-verbal, beyond verbal, if you will.
That's right.
The summaries of what you've collected are essentially describing an experience of an exquisite beauty, however. That's a language, a word they can use.
That's right. But
it's something that's beyond the familiar sense of beauty, right? So is this movement from a familiar sense of being ubiquitous in all the people that you've met who have had near-death experiences?
No, because of the range. I think if somebody just has a brief cardiac arrest and they say, well, I got on the body, it's looking up, from above, I could hear or I could understand what the doctors and nurses were saying, but they couldn't hear me in turn, but then I came back. that person is not necessarily transformed by that.
That's correct, right. They never left the locale environment. Right.
That's right. So it depends on how transcendental this thing becomes, general rule. I mean, some people may just be utterly blown away by the fact that they got out of their body in the first place and say, oh, my God, it destroys my physicalistic.
Sure, it's kind of a game changer.
Right. So, but, it's these full-blown transformations that we see. I think the most common factor in those would be the life review. And then, as you say, beyond that, the sense of beauty and seeing cities of light, for example, just totally indescribable civilizations which seem to be composed of sheer light. And so, there's that aesthetic aspect of the thinking as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think that for reasons that both you and I appreciate, that you cannot draw a logical inference from near-death experiences to the conclusion that there is life after death.
Right.
I think from what we know about life reviews, we can draw, setting the afterlife aside, we can draw an absolutely explosive conclusion, I think quite validly, just from what we know. The conclusion would be, we live through life, then we almost die, then time stands still.
Right.
You're surrounded by a panorama consisting of everything you've ever done.
Right.
You re-witness it from the point of view of the people with whom you interacted. Mm-hmm. Right? And it changes your life. Now, just from those known facts, we can draw this conclusion. At least for some of us, life is a two-phase process. Think about it. First, we lead it forward as the protagonist or actor. Then time stands still. There's a turnaround. Mm-hmm. Then we witness the same actions from the point of view of the other characters.
Right.
And that is mind-bending in itself. And it's a certainty that is the case.
It expands one's viewpoint and knowledge of interpersonal relationships and the value of it. And changes our view of what life is, what a human life is. And the story of consciousness, right? And this is where things get a little dicey in my understanding, because I've had transcendent experiences. Mm-hmm. I've certainly met with beings, because I meditate, and I practiced meditator for a long time. My personal assumption was always that these beings are a reflection of my personal subconscious, perhaps what I'll refer to as a superconscious, or as Carl Jung put it, the part of the collective story of consciousness, the collective unconscious. But before we get too deep into that, I'm very curious about the consistency of the desire and the interaction with such beings when we do this life review as being love in review. I'm very curious to know what you know about their experiences of love and what you've been able to ascertain from those in this life review as to why these beings, quote unquote, I'll put quotes around them for the listener, beings are so interested in the topic of love. Why is love such an important lesson to be learned?
That is a very, very big, aspect of this. And I would say, number one, that we've got to drop our earth-based concepts of love in the first place to think about this. Because people say that I have to use the word love because it's the closest that I have to this, but that it is beyond language, beyond those words. And then another thing it does, I think, is to get us to start thinking about what are the different kinds of love here.
Right.
Yeah, romantic love comes to mind for people usually. And so I think that, what is romantic love? Well, if you think about it, that word roman in French, it means novel, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so, and that strikes me as the case with romantic love is that it's about a story.
Mm-hmm.
People in romantic love they love to tell the story of how they met. So it's the story-based love.
Right.
There's another kind of love that I witnessed in my childhood, but which is very rare these days. And it was, I forgot the word that the Greeks used for it, but it's, we think of the Greeks as city dwellers, as they were, but they were these surrounding farms, right, too.
Right.
So
Certainly.
And the Greeks had observed that in those circumstances, a boy and girl raised on adjoining farms would naturally form friendships in their childhood, and it would just naturally evolve into a marriage.
Right.
And I saw that kind of marriage when I was a kid. Two of my uncles were married to two of my aunts. My aunts were sisters, the uncles were brothers.
Right, right.
And they had been raised and it was just that complete bonding. It was like when my Uncle Clifford died, Aunt Dwight never recovered. And this kind of bonding is one thing, that love that people are raised together and evolve into a marriage is quite profound. And or then there's the agape, the selfless love of others, and so on. And so, right. What are we talking about? Well, fact is, we can't really understand it yet because, as I gather, a mystical experience would be a common exception. And, great mystics have these experiences of love as well, even though they're not in the course of a, cardiac arrest or whatever. So,
sure.
But the people who've experienced these exalted states tell us is that you have to sort of wait till you experience it yourself, because words kind of fail. And so it becomes a kind of trust that you have, I suppose, in what these people are telling you.
I'm only speaking from my personal experience, which really boils down to, more confusion. The more answers or experience I have, the more confusion I get.
There you go. We're on the same wavelength there.
Right. So in my personal experiences of transcendence, it's an ego dissociation where I really can't speak of me as being part of the experience. There really is no I in the experience. It's more of a pure awareness, which includes the awareness of that which I am currently immersed in. And I'll use that word because it feels like an absorption into something. There is no other. There is no subject-object split left, but there is still an experience, and I'm trying to digest and make sense of something that I can't make sense of because the subject-object split gives me a sense of I. So when I'm lost in this, when I'm immersed in this, I don't have a frame of reference. There is no question of love. It is love. There is no understanding of love. Love is expanding and growing and going beyond any. It's like if I bring something to the table that has even a glimmer of my personal concept of love or personal experience, it expands. It almost encourages my environment. It seems to expand and say, oh, good, you got to this point. Here. It keeps moving.
That's exactly
the line.
Right.
Yeah, much like the universe itself. So I'm very curious about the nature of these conversations with another in what I can only call an ego dissociation, which I've heard you refer to in the ontology, and being involved in a transcendent form of environment, one that goes beyond personal experience, only to have maintained that subject-object split. And this is where I get confused with what are these experiences telling us about ourselves? What is it we're trying to learn? Perhaps the lesson is love, but too many questions, Raymond. What are your thoughts about this subject-object split, which necessitates the sense of self. What do you make of what's occurring in these experiences, as far as you can tell from
as
your
far
research?
as I can tell? Okay, where I've come to it is that for many years, I've been able to have flashes of insight that this thing I'm in is illusory,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that it has a narrative structure
Mm-hmm.
and that it's going along. But then the dog would bark,
Right.
or a meteorite would crash in the lawn.
Right.
And so then you are, life is immersive, right? This thing we're in, it's like you just get immersed in it. So
Sure.
from that elevated insight, you're immediately sucked back into the, immersed in it.
Right.
But where I have gotten so far on it, Mark, is like the little moments of insight like that are getting closer and closer together.
Uh-huh.
So that the way I am now, for the most part, I can still keep that insight that this is an illusion, right? But at the same time, I'm immersed in it. Like I yell at the dog the other day, for example, for snarling at me or whatever. So, and so that's where I am at it. And I think it gets, how old are you?
62 this coming July.
62. I'm 78 now. Where I have come, and I think you would have probably realized this by now, but don't you think that the older you get, the more people your age have had some sort of trans-dimensional crossover?
Most certainly.
Like it's kind of rare when you're a young person and they're at the college with everybody, having a party or whatever.
Yeah.
But the older you get, the more the people you're around, it's more likely that they've had some sort of experience of crossing over into some other world. And I've had a number of them. So to me, it helps me realize that, I know this is an illusion, a kind of dreamlike, or that these are the movies, right? I say we are God's stories, is what I say, because, and by the way, one of my favorite books, it's on Amazon. It's called God is Bigger Than the Bible. It's published by Amazon a year or so ago. And in there, I talk about this whole idea that, this gradually awakening through hearing other people talk about their experiences to an experience of God myself.
Mm-hmm.
And, my mind goes back to that title of that medieval mystical work. The Clouds of Unknowing is the name. I think it's from the 13th or 14th, 15th century, but it was by a monk. And it's like when I had my own experience of the presence of God, I understand it's like there is an unknowing to it. There's a darkness to it, but that word is not bad. It's just, I had always kind of made fun of religious people for kneeling, for example. I thought, to the master of the universe, it's going to be important to us, to God, that, we kneel. That's ridiculous.
Right.
But what I found out in my experience is that you can't stand up.
Right. Thank you for saying
I was just, I was sitting in a chair and God just came and I just slipped down into
That's it.
the floor like it was weakness. You can't stand up.
I understand completely. You just, you can't ground that information in any kind of way that allows you to stand on the foundation of your previous knowledge, as if you're an erect tower whose presence and being is all important and strengthened by memory. I understand completely. So I'm very interested in the nature of time in these experiences that you're referring to, because we're talking about the illusory nature of reality. I've had this conversation with many people from different ilks, that reality is a construct of, the mind, or reality is a construct of atoms, that there is no reality. There's more space than there is actual matter in all of the universe. And that reality is, like time, illusory. And this speaks to what the message of the Buddha, for instance, is that, all life is suffering and all suffering is ultimately an illusion. So in this life review, I think you touched on it, where these folks are having the experience of being the other in the interpersonal relationships. Is this like a movie that unfolds for them? Is it all information coming in real time? Is it a one-on-one conversation? Does it happen in time? Does it happen all at once? Any insight on how time plays a part in this with life
what
review?
people say is, they say no time passes. You're just there. It's like your whole life is cut up into little pieces, projected out around you in a hologram, and you can see yourself doing all of these things, and you feel the responses of others, and it's timeless. And in the midst of this, although there are no words, people say they are there with Christ or God or an angel,
right,
who sort of knows all about it, but still feels love and compassion. And that they say, although there are no words, that it's kind of like a question. People say, like, this being wanted to know, like, how have you learned to love, or what, all kinds of different ways they have formulating. But it's, again, it defies our language. But however, once you hear about it in language, philosophy of language and logic were two of my big fields in philosophy. And these are very important areas of philosophy to bring to bear on this, because, all we have of these near-death experiences, unless you've had one yourself, is language, right? And so that becomes a critical factor. And so where I would say we can go with this is that we can correct the cognitive deficits that are inbuilt with this in such a way as to partly overcome the ineffability problem. And I know, because number one, you can just figure it out and see it for yourself, it would work. But also because it's now actually worked. I was a professor of logic and philosophy of language, and since '69, I've been teaching courses and workshops on the concept of how to think about things that don't make sense, or are unintelligible, or nonsensical.
Right.
And this has gone even into full semester length courses in universities on this subject. And it comes with exercises. The students do these cognitive exercises regarding nonsense. And that sounds so abstract, but just let me give you some examples. Listen to the following 4 allocutions. Okay. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toad stood gyre and gimble in the wave. You recognize that as nonsense. All right. Utterance number 2. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of purple spontaneity. Right. That's nonsense too, but you can tell it's a different type, right? Now listen to this third one. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's nonsense too, but yet a different type. Or listen, hat thoroughly the if, well, zoom how's best. That's nonsense too, but a totally different pattern. Right. I have identified, there's just dozens and dozens of different patterns of nonsense. Each one of them, by the way, having its own distinctive effect on the mind. No wonder Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies.
Exactly.
That's a vague measure of the power of nonsense. You're not old enough to remember, but when I was a kid, it was sha-na-na-na-na, sha-na-na-na-na, get a job. It was the blending of nonsense syllables and meaningful parts, which are the essence, by the way, of the shaman song. Shaman song consists of nonsense syllables and meaningless refrains put together with elements of meaningful language, so that the combination is more powerful than either alone. Absolutely. And that's one of the ways that shamans could propel themselves over to the other side.
And it creates a psychic tension in the listener that demands reconciliation on some level, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so what I say is that we can teach ourselves to think logically about nonsense. You've already done it partly. So let's go back to those four examples.
Mm-hmm.
'Twas brilliant, the slutty toves, the holiness breathes the vestigial lips of lipstick of purple spontaneity.
Purple spontaneity.
That cannibal you men just ate was the last one around here. Number hat thoroughly the if, well, zoom, how zest. And now I'm going to give you a fifth, and you just categorize which category does it fit into. The next one is, when you do this experiment, if you smell an odorless gas, it is carbon monoxide. Mm-hmm. That would be an example of the third type, right? Self-contradictions. Well, then not only but what is the most amazing thing that nobody has ever realized, Mark, is this. That the common sense view of nonsense is that if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, the common sense view is that nonsense is something sublinguistic down here that just doesn't make it. But in a very short argument, I can show you that to the contrary, nonsense is something up here. Mm-hmm. That it's more complex than ordinary meaningful language. And let me show you why. And that is that all of the different types of nonsense have in common this one structural principle, that they follow some rules of language, but break other rules of language so that the summation is unintelligible.
Right.
First example, 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. Now, that is following the grammatical rules of English. Mm-hmm. Right? It's English grammar, so much so that you can say, was brillig and the slithy toves. Well, what part of speech is slithy is an adjective, mm-hmm. that toves is a plural noun. Mm-hmm. Okay. But it violates the simple linguistic convention that when we talk, we use only words with a lexical meaning. You can tell from the dictionary, mm-hmm. right? And so it violates that rule, but also it respects the phonetic rules of word formation in English, because slithy toves, do those sound like Portuguese words or Polish words or Spanish? No, they sound like English words.
Old right? English, right? Almost archaic, right?
That's right. Uh-huh. And so, so what that means is that far from being down here, nonsense is a more complicated layer of, and so no wonder that when people have a profound experience, they're compelled to talk nonsense about it. One of the most common expressions among the people with mystics is self-contradictions, right? And
right.
When Abraham Lincoln was president, mm-hmm. there was this formal state ceremony. I forgot what it was called. It was a very important ceremony. And all these people were gathered around the president. Okay. And so his part in the ceremony called for him to mount a horse and to lead the horse away from the scene in a procession. But with all these people standing around, when he got up on the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. Mm. So the horse was bouncing around. Everybody shocked and embarrassed into silence for poor Mr. Lincoln.
Right.
So Lincoln just looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And people just dissolved into laughter. Okay, well, what that means is it's nonsense to say that a horse could get on its own back by putting a hoof in the stirrup and climbing aboard.
Of course.
But you got to admit, nonetheless, that it creates a very vivid image in the mind of that very movement, right? Mm-hmm. All right, now, what in the world does this have to do with near-death experience? You can take any form of ordinary language and you can layer a layer of nonsense over the top of it so it gives you the impression of that form of language, right? And so what people with near-death experiences say, there are no words, right? And number two, this was not in space. And also it was a timeless experience. There was no time. But the best I can tell you is I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. Right. I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative.
It is, isn't it?
And so the presuppositions of the meaning of the travel narrative are time and space. You see, so
Yes.
to be honest, we have to acknowledge that people who come back from a near-death experience, what they tell us is nonsense. Now, does that mean it's something bad? To the contrary. In science, for example, nonsense is a placeholder. That is, it's something we hold on to, knowing full well that it's unintelligible, but in the anticipation that eventually we'll fill in the blanks and we'll make sense of it.
Right.
A good example right now is the fact that if you take the equations of the two most powerful physical theories ever devised, the general relativity and quantum theory, and you integrate those two sets of equations, what you get is unintelligible nonsense. And so that is what I mean by saying that in science and in many areas of life, nonsense is a placeholder. And that's where we are right now with these near-death experiences. They're placeholders, but think about this. Well, let me draw something here. So even though nonsense is meaningless, it may correspond in some way to extra-linguistic reality. For example, I want to give you two nonsense words. These words are just made up to be nonsense by Wolfgang Kerler. Okay, the words are tikita and maluma.
Okay.
All right. Now, knowing that they're just nonsense, which one is the maluma and which one is the tikita?
Okay, so I need to describe to the audience what I'm looking at, and I'm looking at one shape on the right-hand side of the screen that kind of looks like a cell. It has, a cell in formation. I'm going to call that myeloma, and tikita is the more jagged edged structure that is on the left-hand side of my screen. Did I get it?
Absolutely. Over 90% of people say they identify the spiky one as the tikita and the cloudy one as the maluma.
Right.
And so what that means is that nonsense, even if it's meaningless and unintelligible, can correspond in some way to some aspect of extra-linguistic reality. Okay, now let's take our knowledge now that these accounts of near-death experiences are nonsensical travel narratives, right, which we've seen. And so ask, do they nonetheless correspond to something in extra-linguistic reality? Well, number one, people all over the world, back when I was doing this in the 60s and early 70s, I had met people from many parts of the world who had had these experiences and who, unknowing anybody else, nonetheless came up with these same words to describe it, right? And so that means that something about this description somehow, even though it's nonsensical, somehow corresponds to something in extra-linguistic reality, namely their experience. Right?
Do you think it has something to do with the consonant and the sharpness of tikita?
Well, in terms of
staccato.
the tikita maluma, it probably is synesthesia would be the name of that.
Exactly.
That's right. But in cases of the near-death experience, we're dealing with something different.
Right.
So, specifically then, all right, so even though it's nonsense, all these people independently decided that corresponds to their experience in some way. Secondly, back in the 70s, before Life After Life was published, I would bring people together who had had near-death experiences who didn't know that anybody else had ever had such an experience. But in these small groups, you could see that they would say, "Now, I got out of my body." Yes, everybody would say. In other words, that they would use, when they used these expressions among each other, they would relate to it. So there was this communication, even though we know it's nonsense. And number three, numerous times in my career, somebody has told me that they had read about near-death experiences. Subsequently, they would have a near-death experience themselves, and that when they were in the experience, they would say, I went back in my mind to the book, and for example, the first time I heard that was in New Jersey, I guess about 77, 78. Uh-huh. And I'd been invited there for a lecture, but after my lecture, this host couple who brought me there, they had a party in their backyard barbecue party. And the young woman, she was in her 30s then, mid to late 30s. She was telling me that she had read my book about a year before her illness. Then she had a cardiac arrest during her gallbladder surgery, as I recall it was. And she said in her experience, she was saying, this is just like in the book. So what that means is, see, by learning about these experiences in advance, even if you haven't had it,
right,
and know that the words are nonsensical, when you subsequently have the experience, you recognize that.
Yes.
It's what you've heard about before. So, see, what that means is that we are extending the limits of language out into the near death. People relate to those words in a way now that is different.
Right. Which is why I introduced you as being one of the giants of consciousness who helped to expand our lexicon.
Well, I may be a giant in that field, but also it shows me that, you can be a giant, I guess, and feel like a midget. Because I really do say, Mark, this is something I really say sincerely. I'm tired of Raymond Moody.
To be tired of Raymond Moody is impossible in my mindset, but I understand what he means. And if you want to understand what he means, you'll have to tune in to the next episode. My conversation with the fascinating Dr. Raymond Moody continues in the next part. Till then, you have a lot to digest. I hope you will. And I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye for now.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.